Welcome everyone to a meeting of the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization. I'm David Moeller, our President Secretary filling here. You are invited to participate in our transportation planning process regardless of your race, color, national origin, including limited English proficiency, religion, creed, gender, ancestry, ethnicity, disability, age, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, veteran status, or background. Read the full notice of your rights and protections at www.boston_MPO.org/MPO_DISCRIMINATION. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 Level AA standards, and revised Section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, or if you have any technical difficulties, please contact Ibu Kurashi of the MPO staff at iquraishi@ctps.org or 857-702-3695 or via the chat box. All participants will join the meeting with muted microphones. Please rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and affiliation. After roll call, board members may mute and unmute themselves. Always remain muted unless actively speaking. To participate in the discussion, please select the raise hand function. Find this by clicking either on the participants button at the bottom of the screen, and a window will pop up with a raise hand button at the bottom, or the reactions button in the toolbar. The chair will then call on participants. Please raise your hand via Zoom if you would like to use an AI note taker during this meeting. If you're on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand. And the first item on the agenda is introductions. Adriana, could you please call the roll?
Yes. Okay. MassDOT seat 1.
This is David Moeller.
MassDOT seat 2.
Good morning. This is John Bouchard representing Highway Administrator Jonathan Gulliver, present.
Awesome. MassDOT Highway Division.
John Romano, MassDOT Highway Division here.
MBTA.
Good morning. Sandy Johnston here for the MBTA.
Regional Transportation Authorities, Metro West Transit Authority.
Yes, good morning. This is Tyler Tarasi, representing Administrator Jim Nee for the MWRTA, present.
Awesome. Massport. All right, I'll come back to that one. And MAPC.
Travis Pollock, representing Metropolitan Area Planning Council.
Okay. MBTA Advisory Board.
Good morning. Hannah Swilikowski, representing the MBTA Advisory Board.
Advisory Council.
Hey, Carl Alexander from the Mystic River Watershed Association, representing the Advisory Council.
Great. City of Boston, seat 1.
Good morning. This is Jen Rowe representing the City of Boston and Mayor Michelle Wu.
City of Boston, seat 2.
Hi, good morning. Patrick Hoey, representing the City of Boston and Mayor Michelle Wu.
At-large city, City of Everett.
Good morning. This is Eric Molinari representing Mayor Carlo Di Maria and the City of Everett.
At-large city, City of Newton.
This is Jen Martin, representing Mayor Ruth Ann Fuller, City of Newton.
At-large town, Town of Arlington.
Leonard Diggins, representing Select Board Chair Daham Han, Town of Arlington.
At-large town, Town of Brookline.
Good morning. Erin Jude, representing Select Board Chair Bernard Green, Town of Brookline.
Intercore Committee, City of Somerville.
Good morning. This is Brad Rawson with the City of Somerville, representing the Intercore subregion.
Minuteman Advisory Group on Interlocal Coordination, Town of Lexington.
Good morning. Megan Roach, representing Select Board Chair Jill Hay for the Magic subregion.
Metro West Regional Collaborative, City of Framingham.
Good morning. Dennis Giambetti, representing Metro West, and Mayor Charles Szyczki of Framingham.
North Shore Task Force, City of Beverly.
Darlene Nguyen, representing Mayor Michael Cahill for the North Shore Task Force.
North Suburban Planning Council, Town of Burlington.
Good morning. This is John Strauss representing Mike Espaillo, Chairman of Select Board of the Town of Burlington and the North Suburban Planning Council.
South Shore Coalition, Town of Hull.
Vestiario, representing Hull Select Board Chair Erwin Nessoff.
Southwest Advisory Planning Committee, Town of Rentham.
Rachel Benson, representing SWAP, and Chair Chris Gallo for Rentham.
Three Rivers Interlocal Council, Town of Norwood. Right.
Steve Waller,
And, sorry.
representing the Trick subregion.
Great. And Federal Highway Administration. All right. I'm coming back to Massport. Okay, roll has concluded.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is the chair's report. I don't have one today, so we'll go directly to the executive director's report. Tegan.
Thanks, David, and hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for a third week in a row where we are holding board meetings. But I did want to thank everybody first. Next slide, please. Sorry. Next slide. I did want to first just sort of thank everybody in this room for your attendance and participation in the annual meeting. I would consider it very successful. In attendance, we had Interim Secretary Phil Lang, Highway Administrator and Undersecretary Jonathan Gulliver, FHWA Division Administrator Joyce Singh, some mayors, Mayors Cahill from Beverly and Ballantyne from Somerville, and other select board chairs and excellent staff from our partner agencies and municipalities. So I know some of you traveled a significant distance to be there in person, and I really appreciate the effort that you made because I think it is great for us to get together in person a few times a year. I said this in my presentation, but I was really impressed by how many similar themes kind of came across in terms of folks' talking points at the meeting. I think there is this shared acknowledgement, especially of all of the work that the TIP committee has been doing, and in particular, the passing of the TIP milestone and rescoring policies recently. That vote that you made to pass those design milestones was a really important step in the work that we're doing to make sure that we are collaborating better and earlier to deliver projects, which was really embedded in the themes of most folks' talking points last week. And I also want to thank folks for participating and listening to our panel, which was moderated by Elena Ion from the MPO staff. Thank you to Laura Gilmore from the T, Michael Trepanier from MassDOT Highway, and Brad Rawson from Somerville. You all did a wonderful job telling the story of how collaboration can lead to regional benefits. So thank you again. We'll be debriefing on the meeting internally, but please don't hesitate to reach out to me directly if you have any feedback or suggestions regarding the event. Love to take into account any feedback you have before we start planning for next year's event. Next slide, please. So a few weeks ago, I had announced that Scott Pooter would be joining the MPO as a senior transportation planner this past Monday. If that doesn't sound familiar, that's because I actually did mispronounce Scott's name. My apologies, Scott, the first time. But Scott Pooter is joining us with, as I had mentioned before, some pretty extensive public and private sector experience in terms of the applicability to the work that we do here at the MPO, leading corridor studies in particular in Chicago. And so that sets him up very well to be a part of the multimodal planning and design team. And I was hoping Scott could just say hello to this board, just that you can attach that face to a name of this new team members. Scott, could you unmute and just say a quick hello?
Hello, I'm Scott Pooter. I recently moved to Boston to be closer to my family, and my experience is I've worked in several avenues. So I've worked at the Department of Transportation in Tennessee, TDOT, as kind of data management, and then I moved to Chicago and worked in the private sector for over 2.5 years, working on corridor studies, safety action plans, things that align with a lot of projects that are going on right now. So yeah, that's a little bit of my background, and I'm really excited to work with everybody and work with the different subregions and members of the board. So yeah, it's really nice meeting everybody.
Thanks, Scott. Very happy to have you. Folks on the board, please feel free to reach out, and say hello. And I'm sure you'll be seeing more of Scott in the very near future. So next slide, please. All right, today we have, beyond the usual business, a couple of action items and then a presentation on a discrete study. The first action item is to approve a work scope related to fair equity analyses for the MBTA. This scope is setting up a new kind of approach with a 4-year work program, and that's going to help us be more adaptive and responsive when we're requested to do equity analyses for the T. The second action item is an amendment. This will be the second amendment being proposed for the federal fiscal year 26 to 30 TIP, and it'll include changes to the transit program for 2026, along with cost and readiness changes for a number of projects within the state highway program. And then there's also a few funding source changes. So Ethan will go through those details with you and ask for you to vote to release that for public comment. And then finally, we'll have a presentation on last year's what was called a discrete study. There's quite a long name for the study here on the slide, so I won't read it back to you. But what I will say is that this was a study that helped us assess how our data sources and analytical tools that we have at our disposal, like the travel demand model, Replica, Conveil, it was about assessing how they can help us explore questions about the potential impacts of roadway pricing strategies. So Joe DeLordo will talk a bit more about what we learned and what kinds of questions we feel well equipped to answer and improvements we can make to our tools and data sources to be able to answer further questions or fill gaps that we might have in being able to truly explore a robust conversation about this topic, given that that conversation progresses. So really, this is about advancing our ability to provide data-driven support for the region's stakeholders. So I'll look forward to hearing your thoughts and reactions to that. Next slide, please. And then just as a reminder, we're only going to have one meeting in January. So we will not meet on the first Thursday of January. We'll meet on the second, which is January 15th. And at that meeting, just given the time of year, we'll likely have some additional work scopes for you to look at, as well as some perhaps an amendment related to the LRTP. But we'll look forward to seeing you in January. So if this is the last time I get to talk to this group before the holidays and the new year, just want to say happy holidays and happy new year, and looking forward to the rest of the meeting today. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Tegan. Anybody have any questions for Tegan? Seeing none. Next item on the agenda is public comments. Are there any at this time? If so, please raise your hand. Seeing none, if you have a comment during the meeting, raise your hand and we will. I'm sorry, there is a comment raised. Ilias bin Mokrane. I hope I pronounced your name right, Ilias.
Yeah, that was correct. Hello, everyone. Thank you. My name is Ilias bin Mokrane. I'm a Boston University student and someone who relies on MBTA buses. So I created a free online game called Boston Bus Simulator where anyone can drive MBTA bus routes in and around Boston. The game has reached around 1 million plays, and all these people foster discussion about public transit policy and how it affects their cities across the state. So I just want to share that through my work and my experience, I've seen how fare costs in particular are a major barrier for lower income communities who rely on bus service. So I want to voice my support for the MPO's focus on fare equity as you consider the work scope for the analysis, and share a research project I conducted at BU. Where I analyzed fare-free pilots on the 104, 111, and 455 bus routes, because those were the highest ridership routes in the 3 lowest income communities the MBTA serves outside of Boston. So I'm happy to share if any of this research would be useful, and just thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you, Elias. That's really interesting. Thank you very much. Any other comments at this time? Seeing none, if anyone has a comment during the meeting, please raise your hand and we will call on you. Next item on the agenda is committee chairs reports. Are there any? Seeing none, we'll go on to the Community Advisory Council report.
All right, hard to follow that one up too. It was a great public comment. Hi, Carl Alexander, serve as vice chair for the advisory council. Just want to again express gratitude to the MPO staff for giving the council time and space to provide comments at the MPO annual meeting last week. Caitlin Allen Connolly, our chair, underscored the importance that we as a body are seeking to provide a voice for the broader community, add transparency to MPO process, foster healthy debate, build consensus, and advocate for the interests of the council's 17 members. And so, we are planning on meeting next on January 12th as a body, where we'll continue to hear about the impactful and important work of several of our body's members, and also help to provide input on the MPO's work planning process. So again, just wanted to share and express gratitude for everyone's work here collectively, and really appreciate everyone's work on making a holistic transportation network for our region. That is all. Thank you very much and happy holidays.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes from October 23rd. Can I get a motion and a second to approve the minutes, please? And please state your name for the record when making the motion. Brad Ross.
Thank you, Chair. I'll move to approve the minutes as drafted.
Thank you. Jen Rowe.
Jen Rowe, I will second that motion.
Thank you. Motion has been made and seconded. Are there any comments, changes, questions, or suggestions? Seeing and hearing none, please call the roll.
David Mueller,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Sandy Johnston,
Sandy Johnston, yes.
Tyler Terrassi,
Tyler Terrassi, yes.
Travis Pollock,
Pollock abstain.
Hannah Switlakowski,
Hannah Swilikowski, yes.
Carl Alexander,
Carl Alexander, yes.
Jen Rowe,
Jen Rowe, yes.
Patrick Hoey,
Abstain, not present.
Eric Molinari,
Eric Molinari, abstain.
Jen Martin,
Jen Martin, yes.
Len Diggins,
Diggins, yes.
Aaron Shute,
Aaron Shute, yes.
Brad Rawson,
Brad Rawson, yes.
Megan Roach,
Megan Roach abstain.
Dennis Giambetti,
Yes.
Darlene Wynn,
Darlene Wynn, yes.
John Strauss,
Yes.
Chris Diorio,
Chris Diorio, yes.
Rachel Benson,
Rachel Benson, yes.
Steve Olenoff.
Tom O'Rourke is here and he'll be voting for Trick.
Okay, cool.
Thank
Tom
you.
O'Rourke?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Tom O'Rourke, yes.
All right, it passes.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is the approval of the December 4th meeting minutes. Can I get a motion and a second to approve? And please state your name for the record when making the motion. John Strauss. John, you're muted.
I thought I unmuted. John Strauss, I make a motion to approve the December 4th meeting minutes.
Is there a second? Jen Rowe.
Jen Rowe, I will second this motion as well.
Thank you. Motion has been made and seconded. Are there any comments, changes, questions, or suggestions? Seeing and hearing none, please call the roll.
David Mueller,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, abstain.
Sandy Johnston,
Sandy Johnston, yes.
Tyler Terrassi,
Tyler Terrassi, yes.
Travis Pollock,
Pollock, yes.
Hannah Switlakowski,
Hannah Swilikowski, yes.
Carl Alexander,
Carl Alexander, yes.
Jen Rowe,
Jen Rowe, yes.
Patrick Hoey,
Patrick Hoey, yes.
Eric Molinari,
Eric Molinari, yes.
Jen Martin,
Jen Martin, yes.
Len Diggins,
Diggins, yes.
Aaron Shute,
Shute, yes.
Brad Rawson,
Brad Rawson, yes.
Megan Roach,
Megan Roach, yes.
Dennis Giambetti,
Dennis Giambetti, yes.
Darlene Wynn,
Darlene Wynn, yes.
John Strauss,
John Strauss, yes.
Chris Diorio,
Chris Diorio, yes.
Rachel Benson,
Rachel Benson, yes.
Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
All right, it passes.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is a work scope for the MBTA Fair Equity Analysis and Modal Allocation Factors. Tanner Bonner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning. My name is Tanner Bonner, and I'm a data analyst with the MPO staff. I'm here to present the scope for fair equity analysis and modal allocation factors work for the MBTA. This scope has a budget of $250,000 over 4 years, with funding coming from an MBTA contract. The MBTA complies with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which protects people from discrimination based on race, color, or national origin. When the MBTA plans to introduce a fare change, an equity analysis is required under Title VI to evaluate whether the proposed change is likely to have a disparate impact on populations protected on the basis of race or ethnicity, or place a disproportionate burden on low-income populations. MPO staff have conducted fair equity analyses for the MBTA for over 25 years, most recently in state fiscal year 2025, primarily using an agent-based model. A continuously maintained model is essential to complete timely analysis of fair change proposals. The MBTA has requested that MPO staff update and maintain the agent-based model used to evaluate fair changes. As part of this work, MPO staff will update the model on an annual basis. MPO staff will apply the model and other methods to evaluate whether proposed fair changes will have adverse effects for minority or low-income populations. We will also use the same agent-based model to calculate modal allocation factors, which will detail the percentage of revenue for each MBTA fare product that is allocated to each MBTA mode on an annual basis. I ask that the board approve this work program, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Tanner. Any questions for Tanner? Seeing none, can I get a motion and a second to approve this work scope as presented today? And please state your name for the record when making the motion. Sandy Johnston.
Mr. Chair, I will make the motion that we approve this work scope as proposed.
Thank you. Is there a second? Aaron Shute.
I'll second that. Aaron Chute, Town of Brookline.
Thank you. Motion has been made and seconded. Please call the roll.
All right. David Muller,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano.
John Romano, yes.
Now you already said it, but Sandy Johnston,
Sandy Johnston, yes.
Tyler Terrassi,
Tyler Terrassi, yes.
Travis Pollock,
Pollock, yes.
Hannah Switlikowski,
Hannah Swillikowski, yes.
Carl Alexander,
Carl Alexander, yes.
Jen Rowe,
Jen Rowe, yes.
Patrick Hoey,
Patrick Hoey, yes.
Eric Molinari,
Eric Molinari, yes.
Jen Martin,
Jen Martin, yes.
Len Diggins,
Higgins, yes.
Aaron Shute,
Aaron Chute, yes.
Brad Rawson,
Brad Rawson, yes.
Megan Roach,
Megan Roach, yes.
Dennis Giambetti,
Dennis Chiambetti, yes.
Darlene Wynn,
Darlene Wynn, yes.
John Strauss,
John Strauss, yes.
Chris Diorio,
Chris Diorio, yes.
Rachel Benson,
Rachel Benson, yes.
Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
The motion passes, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is FY 2026 to 30 Transportation Improvement Program Tip Amendment number 2, Ethan Lapointe.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Ethan Lapointe. I am a senior transportation planner on MPO staff. My presentation here today is on the second amendment to the federal fiscal years 2026 to 2030 tip. If we can go on to the next slide and the one after this one, please. Amendment 2 includes the funding of 5 earmarks or community project funds within the federal fiscal year 2026 earmark discretionary program. It also includes funding source changes for the design of improvements at Route 126, 135, MBTA, and CSX rail tracks in Framingham. Includes 9 delays to projects within the statewide highway program. More information on that later. And also additional changes across MBTA projects and programs within federal fiscal year 2026, among a couple other changes as well. On the next slide, given that there are quite a few projects and line items being discussed here today, Amendment 2 includes 2 project tables included within the same file on the MPO meeting calendar. The first is a table listing each of the changes for the Cape Ann Transportation Authority, earmark, regional target, and statewide highway projects, and there is a separate table, still included in that file though, for each of the MBTA projects that are included within this amendment. All of these, again, are available on the MPO meeting calendar. As far as structuring this presentation, if we can go on to the next slide, please, we'll be starting off with those projects that have changes within the earmark discretionary programs for both fiscal 26 and fiscal 28 before moving into the other programs. So if we can go on to the next slide as well, please. Starting off with projects in the federal fiscal year 2026 earmark discretionary program. This first project is the reconstruction of Allen Street in Braintree, which is programming a $3.15 million earmark with $787,500 in non-federal match. It's worth noting that this earmark is a portion of the project's total budget of about $8.6 million. That difference in funding between this earmark and that total budget would be subject to a future TIP action or STIP development exercise in order to resolve that. The second project is the reconstruction of traffic signals at C Street along the Southern Artery in Quincy. This is a design earmark for $500,000 with $125,000 in match. And the next project is a returning earmark for the city of Cambridge for the neighborhood electric vehicle charging infrastructure project, $1 million federal earmark, $250,000 in federal match. Similarly, on the next slide, we then have another $1 million earmark, this one to design develop improvements for the Mystic River Path to Minuteman Bikeway Connector in the town of Arlington, another $1 million earmark with $250,000 in match. The next being a $1.3 million federal earmark for the town of Medfield to reconstruct the West Street Route 27 intersection. This being design funding, about $1.3 million with $325,000 in match. This project is being listed under a separate project ID for design here. There is a separate construction ID number for this project of 612807. So again, this amendment is changing the design line item. The construction line item for this project is not being touched by this amendment. And on to the next slide, we then have one change within the federal fiscal year 2028 earmark discretionary program, this being a new bridge and shared use path construction for the Neponset River at Osceola Street between Boston and Milton. This is the allocation of a $1.1 million earmark, specifically repurposed federal fiscal year 2025 earmark funding with $311,205 in non-federal match. Again, this is just the application of an earmark. This project is already funded within the statewide highway program in federal fiscal year 2028. This amendment does not change any of the balances within the statewide highway program for this project, only the new earmark funding. With that, if we can move on to the next slide, this then takes us to one change within the regional target program. The next slide, please. This being for the preliminary design planning work of intersection improvements at Route 126, 135, MBTA and CSX Railroad Crossing in Framingham. Now, this is a project that is funded by the MPO originally for design work in federal fiscal year 2026, but given the current state of development on the project and the proposed scope of work here, this is more aligned with a planning activity than design, and therefore the project's current funding source of surface transportation block grants is being shifted to state planning and research funding again because this is more aligned with a planning activity, therefore it will now be using planning funds to actually begin this work with this funding. There is no net change to cost here. If we go on to the next slide, this then takes us into the federal fiscal year 2026 transit program. On the slide after this, please. Starting off with the CADA Revenue Vehicle Replacement Project, which currently has a budget of $2.4 million with a new budget of $2.96 million. The funding sources for this project are the primary, and the changes within there are the primary drivers of these changes, specifically shifting federal fiscal year 2026 funding away from the State Regional Transit Authority capital funding source to a federal FTA Section 5339 funding source. So this project is programming an additional $1.8 million in Section 5339 funding and an additional $360,000 in toll development credits as match. RTA capital dollars in fiscal 2026 are not being fully supplanted by this. There is still $204,571 of RTA cap, down from the initial $1.8 million. It's also worth noting that there is Section 5307 funding from FTA on this project in 2026, but this action does not change any of that 5307 fund. So again, there is a net increase in cost here of about $564,000 after accounting for all the shuffling of various funding sources on the project to recognize actual costs for vehicle procurement here. Following this then takes us into changes for the MBTA's projects. If we can go on to the next slide, please. And the one after this, please. I actually think this may have been a placeholder here. Starting off within the FTA Section 5307 category for MBTA programs and projects, there are 4 categories for both the Section 5337 and 5307 funding. The first being the Bridge and Tunnel Program, the second being the Revenue Vehicle Program, third the Signals and Systems Program, and the fourth being the Stations and Facilities Program. Now, again, these are programs, not individual projects. The projects that are within these programs are listed in Table 3-9 of the 2630 tip and are also included within the amendment materials here. Given the number of projects that may be impacted as part of this amendment, we won't go through each of them in turn, but within the federal Section 5307 funding, there is a net decrease in funds, fairly slight, between the current budget of 227,811,144 and a similar number, 1,227,686,195 there. So there's a slight decrease between each of these different project level changes for the 5307 funding. This is offset, if we go on to the next slide, within the federal Section 5337 State of Good Repair projects. Again, same programs here, bridge and tunnel, revenue vehicle, signal systems, and stations and facilities. These projects are seeing a net increase across each of these programs of 218,840,290. The current budget is at 1.5 billion approximately. The new budget is at $1.719 billion about there. And again, these are program level changes. Specific projects are listed within Table 3-9. There are additional project changes, however, included within this amendment. Before we get to those, we do have one more program that is seeing a change here. If we go on the next slide, please. This being MBTA Section 3, MBTA projects using Federal Transit Administration Section 5339 funding. This being a budget increase for bus work from about $39.9 million to $62.6 million. And now into the other federal funding category, which largely looks at earmarks and other discretionary funds the MBTA has. On that next slide, please. We then have a slight change in the core capacity funding program for the MBTA from about $3.8 million to $4.075 million. Again, this is based on an anticipated request of funding, not necessarily actual funding that the MBTA has in hand right now. So this represents an increase in request to $4.075 million, not an increase in overall amount of funding. The next is a funding change for the Fairmount Line decarbonization line item. This increasing from $8.71 million to $27.46 million. This increase reflects the flexing of funding from the Federal Highway Administration carbon reduction program from the highway portion of the tip to the MBTA for usage on the Fairmount Line decarbonization project. The next is a project being carried over into this tip for Attleboro Station improvements. The funding for this project comes from the Greater Attleboro and Taunton Regional Transit Authority, or GATRA, at about $645,346. Again, this has been programmed in prior tips before. We then also have a federal fiscal year 2022 RAISE grant, which was awarded for the Linway Multimodal Connector, this being a $20.25 million grant, with additional match, bringing the total project budget to $27 million proposed for programming this amendment. On the next slide, we then have another RAISE grant, this one being for the Lower Broadway Everett corridor, which is being proposed for programming for federal fiscal year 2026. Under this amendment here for $28 million, the Quincy Squantum Point Park Ferry Pier under an FTA passenger grant for $5.415 million, the JFK UMass Station Improvement and Planning Project for $2.5 million, and the procurement of 40-foot battery electric buses, again using flexed carbon reduction program funds to support that effort there on this project. Then on the next slide, please, we have two changes consolidated into one line item for the Lynn Broad Street Corridor Transit Signal Priority Project. These are new programming years for both a community project funding earmark of $220,000 and $297,800 in federal fiscal year 2024 regional target funds. Again, these are two different funding sources. They amount to $517,800 for the Broad Street Corridor. The Quincy Bus Maintenance Facility is also seeing additional carbon reduction program funding flex to it for $5.89 million. There's a system-wide flood mitigation project being carried forward using Federal Highway Administration Protect funding for $5 million, and the Lynn Station Improvements Project being carried forward based on a flex of funding from the MPO's Regional Target Program, including for this line item $34.3 million, but this flex originally included about $34.5 million of MPO regional target fiscal 23 funding and $13.6 million of fiscal 24 funding. So again, this isn't that full amount of what was flexed, at least for this line item, but just noting here that that is the original source of this $34.3 million. We can go on to the next slide. We then have a few other previously flexed funds from the Regional Target Program. $34.05 million for the Columbus Avenue Bus Lane Phase 2 project, $33.5 million for the Jackson Square Station accessibility improvements, the rail transformation early action items for $20 million. Again, those rail transformation funds were flexed across multiple years, $14 million in fiscal 24, $6 million in fiscal 25, now being consolidated to $20 million for fiscal 26, using that carryover ability we have with Federal Transit Administration funding. The Central Square Station accessibility project for $5 million flexed from the fiscal 25 program. And on the next slide, we still have more to go here for FHWA flex funds. The Nubian Square bus circulation improvements for $5 million from federal fiscal year 25, Pelham Park system modernization for $2.5 million from fiscal 25, bus priority accessibility improvements for $1 million from fiscal 25, and the MBTA catamaran overhaul for $2.634 million from fiscal 25, using a combination of ferry boat capital program funds and congestion mitigation air quality funds there. And on the next slide, we then have the Natick Center Station Accessibility Project for $2.5 million in fiscal 25 funds, $5 million for the Wellesley Station Upgrades Project from fiscal 25 target funds. We then have another grant from the Federal Railroad Administration for the Railroad Crossing Elimination Program for $5 million, and back to MPO target funding, a Route 714-716 bus route extension project for $1.875 million, flexed from the fiscal 25 target program. And two more projects on the next slide, please, for the MBTA. There is a planning grant award through the RAISE grant program for South Salem Station planning for $2.776 million, and the Wellesley Commuter Rail ADA Compliance Project, which is a community project funding or earmark, for $500,000 with $125,000 in match for ADA compliance at Wellesley Commuter Rail stations. Again, each of these projects and also those program level MBTA changes I mentioned are included as part of this amendment and include in Table 3-9 for specific project line item changes. We go on to the next slide. We then go into the last section here, which are statewide highway program changes. These are projects that are being proposed as an early action before STIP development for the 2027 to 31 TIP as part of the readiness evaluation that MassDOT statewide highways is currently conducting as far as which projects should be remaining in their own programming years on their sides of the TIP. If we go on to the next slide, I'll note before we get really stuck in here that I'll be mentioning the project level changes and some of the high level rationale as to why these projects may be changing in their program years. But I'm also happy to defer to some of our experts here from Highway Division that have joined us if there are any questions as to the specific reasons why these readiness decisions are being made. So before we get into that, starting off with the Ellis Elementary traffic calming project within the city of Boston. This is actually not a readiness year change, just a small cost decrease. Again, only within the statewide highway program. The cost for this project is decreasing from $2.36 million on the statewide highway program to $2.057 million. This is because there is now an earmark incorporated into this project. So that funding difference is the difference between the allocation of the earmark and the existing statewide highway program funding. The project's total federal participating cost is actually $2.448 million now. So it is technically a net increase overall between all funding sources, but a decrease for the statewide highway program. After this project, this then takes us into project delays, this first being for the Horace Mann Elementary School improvements in Newton, which is seeing a shift from federal fiscal year 26 to 2030 based on increases to the project's scope and how that's implicating the design timeline for the project. Because the project is proposed for a delay to 2030, it is also seeing a cost increase based on that 4% per year inflation factor that's applied to projects that are advancing beyond the current readiness year when they're delayed. Similarly, for projects, if we go on to the next slide, there's one for a bridge replacement in Braintree for J.W. Marr Highway over Monontoquat River. This project is being shifted from federal fiscal year 2027 to 2029. The Stoneham Bridge replacement for State Route 28 Fellsway West over I-93 is proposed to be shifted from fiscal 27 to 28. and the bridge carrying Winthrop Street over the Ipswich River between Hamilton and Ipswich, proposed also for a shift between federal fiscal 27 into federal fiscal 28. And on the next slide, please, we then have a proposal for slope and stabilization work for related projects on Interstate 93. This project is being shifted from fiscal 27 to 28, but is actually proposed for a cost decrease overall of about $106,919. This being changed due to geotechnical work that must be performed as part of the slope stabilization on 93. The Avery Elementary Safe Routes to School project in Dedham shifted from fiscal 27 to fiscal 29 with, again, a similar inflation escalation increase there. And the Harmony Grove Elementary School Safe Routes to School project in Framingham shifted from fiscal 27 to 28. And on the next slide, for the last two projects within this amendment, we then have the targeted multimodal safety improvements on Route 16 project, which is proposed for shifting from fiscal 27 to 28 based on public information meeting scheduling around the project within the city, and the targeted safety and multimodal improvements within the city of Lynn, shifting from fiscal 27 to 28 due to complications around right-of-way for the project. There is no cost change proposed for this improvements project, though, for there. So without further ado, if we can go on to the next slide, and the one after this, please. Staff are requesting that the board vote to release Amendment 2 for a 21-day public comment period, which will begin Monday, December 22nd, and conclude Monday, January 12th at 5 p.m. I'm happy to take any questions on this amendment or defer to those that may know more about me about some of these projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Ethan. Questions for Ethan? Dennis Giambetti.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ethan, just a quick question. One of the earlier slides you have depicting the MBTA, there was, I think, a $90 million increase for station improvements. And I was just wondering if that is just covering increased cost, or does that include the increase in the number of stations being improved?
No, you've gone too far. Go back like 3 slides. One more. So there's a $90 million increase, but also just go back a slide, because the cumulative increase is not 90 million, it's 90 minus 61. So it's like a $29 million increase roughly. Okay. Ethan, do you know whether it's just cost increase, scope changes, or additional stations, or is that something like Sandy or somebody from the T should be answering?
I would need to defer to the MBT on that.
Sandy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do not know the answer off the top of my head, but we can get you that answer.
Okay, Dennis, they will get us an answer.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? John Strauss.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I just had a quick question, Ethan. Some of these forwarding and delays and so forth, is this what we're looking to eliminate when we talked about in the last meeting, our revised standards and different processes that we're going to be used to evaluate the scope of these programs?
So I would note that these are actually all statewide highway projects, which are not being covered under that proposed readiness policy. However, this does reflect that MassDOT themselves are also assessing their own projects and readiness of those projects as they look ahead to their own development of the federal fiscal years 2027 to 31 tip. So while these actions are not directly related to this policy, they are part of a broader effort that other parties and stakeholders within the state are taking to program projects in their best fit years. I hope that answers your question.
No, that's great. So eventually these two streams are going to converge and we're going to move forward on one path so that a project will start and everybody will be on the same page.
Other questions? Brad Rawson.
Thank you, Chair. Building a tiny bit on John's question, one thing that I would be interested in going forward is understanding the coordination process and the information sharing with municipalities that host these projects. We know how important it is for many municipalities to have great partnerships with state agencies like MassDOT and MBTA. And I was taking copious notes and wanting to message intercore municipalities and say, Are you aware of this? Are there any concerns? Is there public engagement work, utility right-of-way work that you feel is unanswered? So, Chair, it's more of a question than a comment, but I think as we continue to move forward with all of our process improvements, acknowledging in some way the municipalities have been consulted and have acknowledged that consultation could be an important process improvement for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brad. Other questions or comments? Seeing none, can I get a motion and a second to release this for a 21-day public comment period? Please state your name for the record when making the motion. Dennis Giambetti, did you have a question or are you making me?
No, I'll make the motion to approve. Send it for
Thank you.
21 days review.
Thank you. Is there a second? Brad Rawson.
Happy to second that motion, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Motion has been made and seconded. Please call the roll.
Okay. David Muller,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
Sandy Johnston,
Sandy Johnson, yes.
Tyler Tarasi,
Tyler Tarasi, yes.
Travis Pollock,
Pollock, yes.
Hannah Switlikowski,
Hannah Swilakowski, yes.
Carl Alexander,
Carl Alexander, yes.
Jen Rowe,
Jen Rowe, yes.
Patrick Hoey,
Patrick Hoey, yes.
Eric Molinari,
Eric Molinari, yes.
Jen Martin,
Jen Martin, yes.
Len Diggins,
Dickens, yes.
Aaron Shute,
Aaron Shute, yes.
Brad Rawson,
Brad Rawson, yes.
Megan Roach,
Megan Roach, yes.
Dennis Giambetti,
Dennis Giambetti, yes.
Darlene Wynn,
Darlene Nguyen, yes.
John Strauss,
John Strauss, yes.
Chris Diorio,
Chris Diorio, yes.
Rachel Benson,
Rachel Benson, yes.
Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion passes, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is roadway pricing, balancing the need for a transition to sustainable mobility with equity considerations. Joe DeLordo.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Joe DeLordo. I'm a data analyst with MPO staff in the Project Analysis and Applications Group. And today it's my pleasure to present the findings of our roadway pricing discrete study from last year's UPWP. Next slide, please. And one more. So first, I'd like to provide a little bit of background about this study. As I mentioned, the roadway pricing study was a discrete study funded through the federal fiscal year 2025 Unified Planning Work Program. This study took a data-focused approach to roadway pricing, aimed at assessing the various data sources and analytical tools that are available to the MPO to conduct analyses of roadway pricing. We were interested in a few key questions, including what data sources are available, what metrics can we measure or estimate using this data, and what key questions about roadway pricing are we able to answer using the outputs of these data and tools. To evaluate these data and tools, we developed a hypothetical roadway pricing scenario as a test case to see how these tools performed under the kind of analysis we might like to conduct when assessing the impacts of roadway pricing. Next slide, please. So the study itself began with a literature review where we familiarized ourselves with prior work done by the MPO on roadway pricing, including the Learning from Roadway Pricing Experiences study from the 2023 UPWP. We also looked at other hypothetical or forward-looking analyses of roadway pricing systems from across the country to understand what tools were commonly used, the proper methodologies for applying these tools, and what kinds of questions and metrics other agencies were interested in. The next step was to explore the available data sources and to identify some potential scenarios to serve as our hypothetical test case. During this phase, we presented at a meeting of the MPO's Congestion Management Process Committee to ensure that our analysis was responsive to key regional questions and concerns around roadway pricing. Next, we developed and analyzed our hypothetical scenario. Our analysis was focused on evaluating data and tools and their ability to help us arrive at a high-level understanding of the potential impacts of roadway pricing. Finally, we produced documentation for this study, including the technical white paper that is posted with today's agenda. Next slide, please. So for this study, We considered 3 different styles of roadway pricing to potentially serve as our hypothetical test scenario. These were cordon pricing, corridor pricing, and parking pricing. Each of these strategies was identified and discussed in the MPO's prior study, Learning from Roadway Pricing Experiences. The preference for cordon pricing emerged through the engagement we conducted with the CMP committee. This is a novel analysis for our region, as prior MPO work through the MBTA Sources of Community Value project consisted of a high-level analysis of corridor-style pricing. There was also a stronger data availability case for cordon pricing, particularly compared to parking pricing. In selecting the area that would encompass this study's hypothetical cordon zone, we prioritized selecting an area with high trip activity for the strongest data fidelity, an area that experiences currently high levels of traffic congestion that could be mitigated through a system of roadway pricing, as well as an area that has strong transit access to many different parts of the region, ensuring that there are ample alternatives to automobile travel. Next slide, please. So here is a map of this study's hypothetical roadway pricing scenario. The zone primarily encompasses the neighborhoods of downtown Boston and Back Bay. It is bordered by the Charles River, Boston Harbor, and Fort Point Channel, as well as Interstate 90 to the south and Massachusetts Avenue to the west. For our analysis of the transportation impacts, we analyzed the effects of both a $9 toll and a $15 toll, which are the prices for the New York congestion pricing system that were implemented and originally proposed, respectively. Next slide, please. So as far as the results of our analysis, we've broken them into 2 key categories for today's presentation. The first is the demographic impacts of roadway pricing. These results largely come from our analyses completed using Replica and Conveil. The second is the transportation system impacts, which are the results from our analysis using TDM23, which is the regional travel demand model for the Boston region maintained by MPO staff. Next slide, please. So on the left side of this table, we have a list of key questions about roadway pricing, and on the right side, there are some corresponding metrics that we were able to estimate to help answer these questions. As far as who would be impacted by a roadway pricing system, we can estimate the demographics of travelers through our hypothetical cordon zone, how many of them identify as minority or live in low-income households, etc. To estimate who would face the choice of whether to pay a congestion charge, we can look at the differences in the demographic breakdowns by how people are traveling, who is driving versus taking transit versus walking, biking, or rolling. Another important question is who would have a viable alternative to auto travel and could shift their trips to transit. So we can evaluate which areas of the MPO region have access to the zone within a given time band via transit, as well as the demographics of the people who live there. And finally, as to whether these trips are well suited to transit, walking, biking, or rolling, we can look at the distances and the purposes of these trips as well. So if we were to conduct an analysis comparing different roadway pricing scenarios, we might like to understand how well these scenarios correspond to certain goals that we might have for roadway pricing or the transportation network. We might set a goal that, for instance, folks who identify as minority or live in low-income households should not be disproportionately affected by a roadway pricing system. And if we go to the next slide, please, here's one way that we could evaluate that. Our analysis found that, on average, people who live within a 30-minute transit trip of the hypothetical cordon area are more diverse, with 47% identifying as minority, and have lower incomes, with 27% living in low-income households, compared to the MPO regional average, which is 37% minority and 19% low income. Next slide, please. As far as the transportation impacts, there are a few key questions that we were able to answer with the data and tools available to us. We were, of course, interested in how many more people might choose not to drive, so we were able to calculate the changes in the driving, transit, and active mode shares. As far as congestion reduction, we estimated the change in vehicle miles traveled and vehicle hours traveled across multiple different geographies. On the transit side, there have been questions about the capacity of the transit network and its ability to handle additional trips that might result from a roadway pricing system. So we can calculate the changes in transit ridership and park and ride facility usage. And finally, for a high-level approximation of annual revenue, we were able to calculate that by looking at the number of vehicles that are still entering the zone each day. And if we go to the next slide, please, we'll see our sample results. which is that with a $15 charge, our analysis found a 31% decrease in vehicle miles traveled within the hypothetical cordon area and a 43% decrease in vehicle hours traveled. There are also additional decreases throughout the rest of the MPO region, which suggests a region-wide decrease in vehicle travel rather than a redistribution of existing traffic to avoid the hypothetical cordon zone. Next slide, please. So overall, the MPO has a robust suite of tools available to analyze the impacts of roadway pricing. Using Replica, staff were able to estimate demographics, mode shares, and origin-destination patterns in our hypothetical scenario. Conveil provided a high-level analysis of destination access and has the capacity to handle more detailed analyses and even different transit service scenarios. TDM23 is very important to this analysis, as it's the one tool we analyze that allows us to explore the interaction between roadway pricing and potential changes in travel behavior. Metrics from TDM23 include mode shift, vehicle miles traveled and vehicle hours traveled, transit ridership, air quality impacts, and a high-level approximation of annual revenue. In the earlier scenario selection phase of the study, we also used 2 additional data sources to help identify areas that might benefit from roadway pricing. The National Performance Management Research Dataset, or NPM-RDS, provides nearly real-time congestion data for heavily traveled roadways in our region, which was helpful for identifying corridors or areas that might benefit from congestion reduction. The CMP Multimodal Network, which was developed by MPO staff, visualizes highly traveled roadways, transit lines, and active transportation routes, and provides a holistic multimodal picture of trip activity and transit access in our region. Next slide, please. So the work completed for this study revealed several areas of future research for us to focus on for future research on roadway pricing in our region. The MPO could evaluate multiple different roadway pricing scenarios, such as other geographies or types of roadway pricing system, through an iterative process to better understand the potential range of regional impacts. There's also the possibility to conduct a more transit-focused analysis of roadway pricing. This could involve quantifying the benefits to travel time, ridership, and destination access due to reduced traffic congestion. We could also model the effects of transit service improvements, such as frequency improvements or service expansion, coupled with a roadway pricing system. There are also many opportunities to further explore the capabilities of the TDM23 travel demand model, including varying model assumptions around factors like work-from-home behavior and exploring more detailed model outputs. Next slide, please. So to summarize the work completed for this study, MPO staff were able to evaluate multiple measures of the potential congestion, revenue, and equity impacts of roadway pricing using the data and tools that are already available to us. Overall, the MPO has a robust suite of tools available to support analyses of roadway pricing. Each of the tools presented here would be useful in future analyses, and combining the outputs of several data sources will provide the greatest understanding of the potential impacts of roadway pricing from several different perspectives. Finally, there are ample opportunities for further research into these data sources and the potential impacts of roadway pricing in the region, which will allow the MPO to address a diverse set of regional priorities in its future roadway pricing research. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Joe. Questions for Joe? Will Palmer.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for a really interesting presentation. A question and a comment. Yes, the comment just being that both Transit Matters and the Community Advisory Council really encourage MPO staff to continue exploration of roadway pricing strategies to reduce congestion and support the maintenance and expansion of the public transit system. So thank you so much there. We also were curious, what do you see as the next phase of this work? I know you spoke about some potential next areas, but is there any particular one that you would see as the next phase? Thank you.
Hagan, you want to handle that one? I mean, I'm happy if you want Joe to, but that's sort of a policy question. Hagan, you want to take it or you want Joe to?
Sorry, how is that? Can you hear me?
No worries. Yeah, we can hear you.
So the question being about what the next phase of this work will look like, just to confirm, sorry. So the what we've already worked with this board to approve is another discrete study that we're looking to carry out in this current year. which the scope of which should come to you relatively soon, either at the next board meeting or soon after that. And what that is doing is looking more at the stakeholder side and the messaging side around these kinds of strategies, so that we're both building up our understanding of the technical tools and how they can apply to exploring and answering questions, but also how one could develop a successful strategy of engaging stakeholders and telling the story of what congestion pricing can accomplish. So both of those things are equally as important. And other next steps and next phases include taking some of the recommendations from these studies and how we can improve our tools and our data sources, and actually acting on those recommendations so that we're better set up to have these conversations in the future. Joe, if I could just defer to Joe, if you wanted to add anything else to that, just based on this particular study, please feel free to do so. But I think I answered it from a broader agency perspective.
Yeah, I think from the technical perspective, our white paper that's attached to the agenda for today's meeting has a whole section about potential areas of future research that went into a little bit more detail than I did about in the presentation here. I think the key takeaway is that there are a lot of areas for us to still do further research in, and we have the tools to be able to answer a lot of questions. It's just a matter of figuring out, what questions are, sort of a regional priority, what questions the board would like us to take a further look at. But sort of within the arena of, we have a large universe of potential questions to be able to answer on the technical side as well.
And if I can just emphasize what Joe said, which is that we really do look to you all as board members and the committees to help push us forward in the way that you as a board want to see this work progress.
Thank you. Tom O'Brien.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. O'Rourke.
I'm sorry, Dr. O'Brien. I'm sorry, Tom. I apologize.
No worries. Just wondering if any thought has been given to studying what like the economic impact of something like this might be. You have the potential of discouraging people from going into the city to spend money, and I wonder what that might look like.
So as far as trip making patterns, trips to the zone, that is something that we were able to calculate. There is some diversion of trip activity, at least in the hypothetical scenario here, that we were able to quantify. There are some limitations in the technical tools that we have as far as, trips that are not being made at all, that TDM23 is not necessarily able to calculate. But I think that's an area where we might also look to the experience of other regions as well, areas like New York or London that have implemented a roadway pricing strategy, to understand what the economic impacts have been, both as far as making auto travel more expensive, but then also how does that balance against the benefits of reduced vehicle congestion as well.
Thank you.
Lynn Diggins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Great work. And of course, I'd like to see more research on this too. So I'll make my pitch for quadrupling the UPWP discrete studies budget. But I know that we have to live within our means, and so there's only so much we can do. But so some questions, so on page 17, the table 2 indicates that it seems like let me see if I can go right to the table. It seems like there's an indication that the non-English speakers are walking further.
Um,
Let me see if I can pull up the number. 17, table 2.
Yeah, I don't know that we did a breakdown of trip distances necessarily by demographic groups. That is the kind of thing that we could be able to do. I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Part of the results that we might be seeing here is that there are just a higher proportion in general of folks who do not speak English at home making trips to this cordon area compared to the just total MPO population.
Okay.
But I don't think there was an explicit link made between that and the distances of those trips.
Gotcha. Okay, great. And so kind of along those lines, how many of those who drive like greater than 5 or 9 miles and live within a half-mile transit, and do you have a sense of what their income and minority distribution is?
Yeah,
That's in
I think
table 3. Yeah.
Yeah, so with the trip distances, we didn't do a whole lot of demographic breakdown of this. You
Okay.
certainly could, though. You certainly could, using Replica, look
Okay.
at trips. You sort of group those trips by distances and see what the modal, not only this is showing the sort of modal breakdown, but then also within that, looking at where specifically in the region are people driving from, who is making those driving trips. That was something, the inclusion of trips that originate near rail and ferry transit stations in
Yeah.
the white paper was something that was, an interest that was expressed by the CMP committee as well, to understand, the modal choices of people who are originating near transit stations and could potentially make those trips via transit instead.
Yeah.
So that is an area of, I think a great area of future focus is understanding a bit more of those kind of interactions and impacts
Right.
within that data.
But that's data that require like another research project. It's not something that you could just break out and give to us.
Yes,
Right.
that not with the breakdowns and the analysis we currently have.
Gotcha. Okay, fine, fine. When you mentioned on page 28 that you doubled the parking, you saw like more parking utilization. I guess this was in TDM, 23. When you did that, was there a sense that there was even more demand for parking, than the double that you provided? I'm trying to understand, like, what is the demand for parking versus what might have been an artifact of just increasing, the parking allotment by 2x.
Right. I think so in looking at the park and ride capacity, for context for folks who might not have read the white paper yet, we were interested in whether the capacity of park and ride facilities might be constraining the ability of folks to shift driving trips to transit park and ride trips. So to sort of look at that, we basically doubled the capacity of all of the park and ride facilities within the model. So I think, as we further explore the capabilities of TDM 23 and we understand, we might get to a point where we sort of understand what the true maximum demand might be. Based on the way that TDM 23 calculates, demand for park and ride and assigns trips to park and ride, you know, it will increasing the number of park and ride spots available will increase demand because it essentially lowers the price. It increases supply relative to whatever the demand might be. So I think so what we did see was that, there was a large increase in particularly commuter rail ridership when we increased the park and ride capacity within that $15 scenario. But sort of this is, I think, just a first look at what those interactions might be. And I think another area of, again, understanding the capabilities and the sort of model interaction structures
Yeah,
within
that's
that.
really interesting because especially if we have like a lot of low income people, further out. So that's really interesting. Thanks for that. And talking about the revenue impact, which seems very positive, did you take into account that, like New York, we would want to discount, the cost being for low income users?
Yeah, so for this, basically just given the time and resources that we had, we just charged all vehicles the same price.
Okay.
So for the TDM 23 analysis, we had our $9 scenario,
Right.
And our $15 scenario, and you know, um, autos, medium trucks, heavy trucks, and no matter where they were coming from, they all paid the same toll. So I think that is an area of, I think, further model development and further developing these tools that are available to us would be to have those sort of differential prices available, and maybe doing some off-model work as well to understand how those kinds of discounts or exemptions or things like that might play out.
Gotcha. One more question, a quick comment, Mr. Chair. So are we able to study the impact of accidents, injuries? I know you didn't, but is that something that we have the ability, to look at, like reducing congestion, reducing trips, in the Corton area? Would that be something that we could do?
We could look at that. I think, we have our ongoing Vision Zero work, I think, as a really interesting question is what is the relationship just between vehicle travel and congestion and roadway incidents like that. So I think if you have the reduction in vehicle miles traveled and vehicle hours traveled, from the model, there is, I think, a analytical capability to try to answer those kinds of questions in the future.
Yeah, I love us to just look into that and treat this as one tool in our toolbox for just making transportation more equitable and better for everyone. So I certainly have more ideas. I'd love to talk with anyone, especially you, about this more. Thank you. Thank you for great work.
Thank you,
Mr. Chair.
Sandy Johnston. Sandy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Since we're talking about park and ride capacity and transit service, I'm just trying to recall from looking at the white paper what you looked at in terms of future capacity on the transit network and any potential future changes. Just reviewing it here briefly, it seems like you maybe took some initial look at what the capabilities to include that in the modeling might be, but haven't done extensive analysis. Is that correct? And could you tell us a little bit about what you would need to explore in the transit capacity expansion and service improvements that would be needed to accommodate future mode shift or such a scenario that we're looking at here?
Absolutely. So our basically our base scenario, if you will, for this analysis, we compared the results to our 2050 to the long range transportation plan scenario. So this has all of the improvements that are basically modeled and funded from Destination 2050. And that includes, relative to the model's base year, that includes the Green Line extension, and that includes, I believe, a full build out of bus network redesign. So that was the reason that we chose that as our base scenario, was the inclusion of those transit improvements that are already present in that scenario. Again, just because of the sort of time and resource constraints, we didn't have the opportunity to do a whole lot more exploration into the specific capacity analysis. I think this is in terms of building up MPO staff capacity and the methodologies to be able to do that. I actually think this is where the heavy rail capacity analysis work that I presented at a previous meeting and is currently ongoing will be really helpful, just as far as our own ability to interpret model outputs and how they relate to the capacity of the transit system. But I think we did not model any, additional capacity or service improvements beyond what is, in the long range transportation plan 2050 scenario.
Brad Rawson.
Thanks, Chair. Great presentation, Joe and team. And I want to underscore something that I heard Tegan say a minute ago, which I think is really important. The case studies and the literature review and the best practices that are emerging in this space clearly show that technical analysis and modeling will only take the policy discussion so far. I do not say that to undercut the value of the work that Joe and team have done, but rather to lift up the importance of the next phase that Tegan described, which is how can we learn from experience, treat people around the region with respect and with transparency, model the full suite of positive and negative benefits on things like land use, economic activity, as Tom said a minute ago, and really try to build in some space for dialogue and coalition building to avoid some of the challenges that other peer cities and regions have experienced when the technical side gets too far in front of the community engagement side. So I really appreciate that vision and that definition of next steps. I had a couple of quick technical items. Len referenced one of them, definitely interested in the connection with the Vision Zero action plan. So thank you for acknowledging that, Joe. Definitely interested in some of the transit connections that Sandy described. And I think I heard Joe say that regional rail and rail vision is not yet captured. I think that's critically important, but it's really great that we're already moving forward with the heavy rail capacity study, as Joe noted a minute ago. And the last thing I'll say, Chair, is I'll be curious if there are spaces for our partners at MEPC to make sure that the land use assumptions and that intentional growth around transit nodes around all subregions can be captured effectively in this modeling work. And is there sensitivity that occurs when we actually stimulate economic development, housing densification all around the region, consistent with local plans? So again, great work, team. Thanks. Look forward to supporting this going forward.
Thank you, Brad. Travis?
Yeah, I just want to echo a couple of things people said and have another question. So I think it's good if we continue to do research in what is happening elsewhere, especially in New York City. I believe I saw something about the positive impacts on air quality, not just in Manhattan, but regionally, that the New York City program is bringing about. I think my question I had about was the commuter rail service reflected with Rail Vision? It sounds like no. But I think that'd be something to look at in the future, obviously. Curious, is there any idea of what the impacts of the bus system are, of the MBTA bus network, in terms of like with lower VMT? Does that mean, can we evaluate what that would mean in terms of faster buses or more on-time performance?
Yeah, that last piece is something we've definitely thought about. Basically within the travel demand model, the performance of the buses is tied to the performance of the street network. So with fewer vehicle miles traveled, less congestion on the roadway network, the buses will, go through their routes faster, better schedule adherence, things like this. So quantifying those benefits is an area of focus for future research that we've already identified on the technical side as part of a more transit-focused analysis that might also, look at some of these other questions. But that's definitely a piece that we've been interested in, and quantifying those benefits would be a really interesting piece of this.
General?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to confirm, I saw Will Palmer's hand up as well. Although, actually, maybe Will's not the designated
Nope, he's not
representative.
an
Okay,
he's
I
not
see.
an MPO
Okay, I
either.
understand. Okay. Sorry about that. Well, thank you. I appreciate the
We
opportunity.
will be calling on Will, but he's
Yes.
on MPO.
Okay.
We're
Okay.
taking
Yes.
MPO
Okay.
business now.
Didn't want to step in front.
Yep, nope.
So yeah, first wanted to say congratulations to staff on a really impressive body of work. Set out, I think, the best studies come from very clear initial questions, and I think in this case it was clear. We know enough about roadway pricing as this powerful tool we've seen applied in other places that could reduce congestion, shift trips to cleaner, climate-friendly modes, and generate a significant, really much needed amount of funding for transportation. So we kind of have a overall sense of the potential benefits. We also know that these things take years of groundwork to build a durable consensus, and that they tend to be least popular before they're implemented. So kind of pointing to Brad's comments around and Tegan's note earlier about the need to do that type of work is really important. But that also can't, any stakeholder analysis isn't going to be effective without being us kind of building the joint understanding of those benefits, and how revenue might be used to mitigate impacts for those who have the fewest choices. So I think I just want to applaud staff for like presenting breaking out an important question. Do we have the data and tools we need to really build a joint understanding over time? And coming back with some very clear answers on like what our current data and tools can tell us. It sounds like we can learn a lot about access, travel choices, reliability, emissions, and revenue, and a lot about the differential impacts on residents depending on their demographics, depending on their place of residence, and also like some very clear areas of future focus that would, are also things, it sounds like from the conversation here, that we care about as well, and that would be important parts of that conversation. Hearing about, the economic impacts, hearing about the crucial role this would play in the transit system, both the need for capacity as well as any ways that revenue could be used to improve reliability. So I guess my question is, from what's been said earlier, it seems that we have like clear avenues for staff continuing with on the stakeholder side. I think there were a few areas that I'm a little unclear around. Is the work to the TDM model, is that going to continue as part of regular model development? Are there particular aspects that would need kind of our board's direction to expand the amount of resources associated with it? So I guess sort of my question here is there a follow-up on kind of where that so that the board can take a kind of have a presentation of here's what the potential we've seen what the potential avenues of exploration are, but what are the decisions we might need to take to kind of enable the ones to move forward that we feel like are most important and timely. Yeah, that's the question there.
Dagan, I think that's you.
I think
Again,
that's
you can see to Joe, but I think that's you. That's a money question.
I'll see.
yeah. I mean, I think it's I'll start, but Joe, you may want to talk about how again how some of the work could be embedded going forward without it being discrete efforts. So I think just alluding to what we mentioned below or before, sorry, Joe mentioned before, there are clear actions that we can take coming out of this to improve our tools, so that those kinds of things might be embedded into our ongoing development work with either data or the tools that we have. But at a larger picture, in terms of committing resources to doing these efforts, so far we have had discussions about doing this work in kind of a very narrow space of the separately funded discrete studies. I think there's lots of work that we do ongoing that could always serve to influence or be a part of this kind of conversation. But to really commit resources to advance it, those are conversations we should have within the conversations about the UPWP. Like, how are we allocating our funding overall, and what are we focusing that funding on? We have existing programs. There's no one program where the idea of roadway pricing neatly fits into. So that's why we've been talking about it as a discrete study, but also to sort of elevate the results into their own separate deliverables that we present to the board on. But when we're talking in the UPWP committee or otherwise about what kind of work the congestion management process program is doing, what work the multimodal infrastructure program is doing, what work some of our data program work is doing, we can talk about how to make sure we're elevating and embedding the types of things that can help advance this conversation. And we can continue to talk about advancing discrete studies as these independent paths forward. But that is a decision that you all can work with us to make as part of developing the UPWP, which is where we document that prioritization of our resources.
Thanks, Dave. Any other questions from the MPO or this public? So we'll put his question in the chat, Joe. If you could just read it. I think there's an easy answer. You probably know this off the top of your head.
Yes, the question is, are the distances listed in the report as the crow flies or physical mileage traveled? I believe they are mileage traveled.
I would expect that was true. I'm glad to hear it is. Thanks, Joe. Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you very much. Next item on the agenda is member items. I have one. I just want to take this moment, because it's the last meeting of the year, to thank staff for all their hard work. Been a great year. Everybody's done a great job. We all appreciate all the work you do. We don't often get enough time to tell you that, but you do a really great job, and you do it very professionally. So on behalf of the MPO, I'd just like to say thank you. Other member items? Seeing none, can I get a motion and a second to adjourn, and please state your name for the record? Lynn Diggins.
I'd like to make the motion to adjourn, and thank you, Mr. Chair, for being a great leader.
Thank you, Lynn. Brad Rawson.
Second that motion, as I will also echo Len's compliments to you, Chair, and your compliments to staff. Thanks for a great, productive, collaborative year, everybody.
Thank you. Motion has been made in second. Are there any objections? Seeing and hearing none, thank you all very much. Have a great rest of the year. Have a great holiday and a great rest of the year. Bye. See you in January.